I also realized that there were many people in the same boat as my friend that were having trouble and turning to the church for help and finding very little oftentimes.
Welcome back to Mic'd Up Militants. I'm your host, David Gordon. Marriage, it's the sacrament of life ordered towards the begetting and education of offspring and the holiness and good of spouses. It's the peerless font of societal vigor, renewal, and maintenance. So it's absolutely no surprise that it's come under blistering diabolical attack, especially over the course of the last several centuries, when the souls of the faithful, malnourished by the emasculated preaching of churchmen, embarrassed by the doctrines of their own church, were ripe for the picking. Wreck marriage, and you wreck the entire world. There's been a deafening ecclesiastical silence on the evils of divorce, contraception, feminism, annulment abuse, homosexuality, and adulterous second unions. Not necessarily at the institutional level of the church, but at the parish level, which is, for all intents and purposes, Rome for the Mrs. Murphys of the world, as Aidan Kavanaugh dubbed them. Great scandal and tribulation has followed, of course. So here today to discuss this is John Clark, author of Betrayed Without a Kiss, a Tan Books publication. John details the foregoing problems in the book and, God willing, can help shine some light on the path forward today. Thanks for being on, John. I appreciate you being on the program with us.
Thank you, David. It's so great to be here.
Absolutely. Can you just tell us right off the bat, what prompted you to write this book right now?
So a few years ago, a friend was having some trouble in his marriage. Looked like a divorce was going to be on the horizon for him. And he came to me for some advice. And so in an effort to provide him advice, I wanted to go back and do some research. What's going on? Why are the numbers of divorce up in broadly in America? What's happening with annulments? And what is the church doing to nourish marriages in trouble? What's being done to reconcile? So basically, this book is the result of much of the research that I did in an effort to try to help my friend. And there were some pretty disturbing findings. But largely, that was the impetus in terms of, okay, I want to help my friend. What can I do? Because I also realized that there were many people in the same boat as my friend that were having trouble and turning to the church for help and finding very little oftentimes.
You know, I've heard that before. So, of course, that is a great reason to write a book, to call people back to kind of a life of holiness and even to help save a marriage. I mean, what better thing can you do, what more selfless thing can you do than to sit down and try and put together sound doctrine for them and a path forward. So what, in your view, then, are the three greatest, most existential threats to Christian marriage right now?
Well, I think realistically, there has been it's hard to, I would say it's difficult to put it at three, but let's start with this. I think that in effect, there has been a de facto rejection of matrimony as a sacrament. And so I would put it this way. What sacrament finds itself under relentless scrutiny like matrimony does, right? So if you walk into the back of a church in America right now, it would not be surprising to find a brochure about an annulment, like how to get an annulment. Imagine that. Imagine that if instead of that, it was a brochure to try to figure out how to annul your parish priest's holy orders. What responsible person would put that brochure in the back of a church? What responsible person would put something, was your baptism valid? I mean, you see where I'm headed? So largely, there is a denial of matrimony as a sacrament, and the reason I say that is that we shouldn't treat sacraments like this. So I think there is that. So largely, these things sort of, everything sort of is based on an annulment culture we have. It's funny, since I started writing this book and started speaking about it, people don't like it when I say we have an annulment culture. But I wonder what numbers they are looking for before I'm allowed to say annulment culture. Because if in the late 1960s, the church granted about 350 annulments. That is to say, I believe the number in late 1968 was 336 annulments. That is every parish combined. That's every diocese combined in America. Total 336. One generation later, there were 72,000 annulments.
Wow.
So 336 to 72,000. Something's broken. We know it's not the sacrament because sacraments don't break. And so when we talk about the problems that the church is having, the problems that are happening inside the church, largely we're looking for annulments as sort of like the first resort, not the last. We're not even trying to really reconcile couples. And I think that's the problem. And I think the problems grew out of that. I think we have a contraceptive culture too, and I think that happened alongside of the boom. So that's clearly one of the biggest problems we have. And then there's just I think overall there is very little spoken about in church from pulpits about the goods of marriage. I would say those are, if you want to look at 3 items, I would start there. Those are 3 things we need to fix.
Sure, and let's get to those in turn. For right now, though, will you just tell the viewer what are the primary and secondary ends of marriage? Because those things themselves there's been an attempt to muddy those waters, and an attempt to almost overhype the secondary at the expense of the primary, and you see that by guys like Skillebeek.
That's right. So I look at it this way. So this is irreformable doctrine. The primary purpose of marriage is the procreation and education of children. That is irreformable doctrine. That doesn't mean that people treat it that way. The secondary ends would be an aid to concupiscence and mutual assistance. Those should be, and in the book I illustrate how the secondary ends aid the primary end. What mutual assistance? It's easy to see how mutual assistance, for instance, would aid the procreation and education of children, right? So it's funny because I come from the Clark family. We're sort of big into homeschooling. This is a pretty well-known thing, and it becomes really clear when you talk about education, because education it'd probably be better to say upbringing. So when you look at these things together, you think about the fact that these things support each other. So mutual assistance is also to raise children. It's to raise children together. And it's fairly obvious to anybody that doesn't have sort of a strange political bent that children are meant to be raised by a mom and a dad. So, but you're right. The problem has been the denial of the primary purpose of matrimony. And frankly, I think there has also been a denial of the secondary purposes also, right?
Absolutely.
Because and that's the problem. So it's all sort of happened together. There's been a denial of all of it.
Well, I've actually seen firsthand the denial of marriage as hedge against concupiscence, because that actually happens to fly in the face of the absolute autonomy for women in particular, but people in general, that feminism demands. So the marital debt, the conjugal debt, it being a sin to, without good reason, refuse sexual relations to your spouse, because that could that could lead them into sin and concupiscence, temptation. Those things are frowned upon, and I've heard that even at the theology graduate level, where people are calling that into question before, which is just established, church moral doctrine. Why are people trying to muddy the waters on this, though? What's the agenda at play? Why would anybody, something that's been settled in the eyes of the church for so long, why does anyone want to muddy those waters?
Well, there's a few things going on, I think. The first one is that there was an infiltration in the church, and I detail that. I provide some detail on this about how there was a Marxist infiltration. And I know people think of that and think, Marxist infiltration, how could that be? Well, it's pretty well documented. So you have Bella Dodd coming out and speaking about that. I believe it was Paul Kangor did an entire book about this. So you have that. You have socialists that are coming into the church for the purpose of spreading socialism and Marxism. So that's a problem. The seminaries for decades were pretty awful. That's another part of the problem. And I think largely too, the great temptation, I think, of the church in the last several generations has been to sort of, probably the nice way to say it would be to be overly pastoral, right? So what has happened there, though, is that a lot of times when people say we're just trying to be pastoral, what they're not doing is being doctrinal, right? But the problem is that if a pastor is not being true to doctrine, he's not being pastoral. These are things that actually do go together or and fall together. So, but I think largely speaking that much of the hierarchy of the church has wanted to just sort of play along. Nobody likes to lose friends, right? And I think largely, I think priests and bishops fall, they have the same problem. And I think that's largely it. Somebody needs to stand up. And in the book, I speak about the fact that the church has failed to police heresy and heretics. Well, if you don't do that for long enough, you got problems because people don't know what the church teaches any longer, or certainly don't know it well enough.
Sure. Is there something that goes along with denying the primary ends of marriage are begetting and educating offspring? Is there something that is some implication of that somehow bolsters the sexual revolution and kind of that ideology that has absolutely deluged America and the West at this point?
So I guess I'd look at it this way. Like I said, the church should have been standing up and reaffirming the primary purpose. But the problem is that when all these things started happening, I don't think it's any accident that the rise in annulments happened alongside the sexual revolution, which basically denied the good of children. So if you go back to, you see like the Paul Ehrlichs of the world, and you talk about overpopulation. So there was from the economic side of this, what are you doing having children? So it went, we started using the term, I say we, much of the hierarchy began to use the term responsible parenthood. Well, the problem is that sort of, that's a sort of a way of it's a terminology of the left, let's say, right? So, my wife and I have 9 children. Is that responsible parenthood?
That is
I thought it was very
irresponsible, sir.
I thought it was very responsible. We would have had more. We were able to have 9, and that was great. But, part of the problem is, too, the church needs to foster, nourish large families. And that has not happened, too. And I think there have been too many incidences of, that someone in the church hierarchy will make a comment that is very unfortunate and it does anything but support large families, and that's part of the problem. But the problem is that basically the hierarchy of the church, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, the hierarchy of the church has gone right along with society. The church is supposed to say, society's wrong, here's what's true.
Sure. And, I think this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the show today. The doctrine's right there in black and white. I mean, people try and toy with it, as you were noting, obviously, the Pontifical Commission on Contraception that in the 60s that wanted to make the rules more lax. They start talking about parental responsibility, responsible parenthood, having smaller families and whatnot. Of course, that was rejected ultimately by Paul VI. But you see people beginning to talk in these heterodox ways on the margins, but it's never the institutional church. It's the pastors. It's certain bishops. They're not making what's black and white in the institutional church available to their flocks. They're almost stifling it, which is why I said in the opening that these guys seem to be embarrassed of the very doctrine of the church that they are representing to their people on any given Sunday. It's truly bizarre, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, look, the fact of the matter is that if we're not hearing sermons about doctrinal matters, what are the sermons about? And so that's why you get sort of these wishy-washy sermons, and you get sermons about, defense spending or things like that. But one of the most tragic parts of all this is that the teaching on marriage and the sacrament of matrimony, it's beautiful teaching. God loves marriage. God hates divorce. It says in the book of Malachi, God hates divorce, but God loves marriage.
Yeah, next question. We're getting into that.
So we need to think about, why does God, that should start a line of questions, right? Like, God loves marriage. Why does he love marriage? So this is why I wanted to start off in the book, going back to the book of Genesis. If we want to know what God intended for marriage, let's look at that. So if we look at Genesis, we see that marriage is indissoluble. We see that the primary purpose is the same primary purpose it is right now. We see the mutual assistance. We see all of that. And remember that the sacraments are restorative in nature. So Jesus is restoring marriage to what it was intended to be in the garden. And so the Genesis narrative in that section ends in, Adam and Eve, the fall of creation. But then we go to the book of John and the wedding at Cana. And Mary says to Jesus, they have no wine. Well, what's really going on there? Mary knows that when she says that, that begins the road to Calvary, right? Because his public life, if he performs the turning water into wine, that begins his public life. And that's exactly what happened. So how important is marriage to Mary? Pretty important. And I think that we need to sort of look at this from a really scriptural perspective and say, but how beautiful is that? So the wedding feast at Cana, it's a fascinating scene because we don't even know the name of the couple. Scripture, it's not in Scripture, right?
Sure.
What we do know is this, is that from the very beginning of that couple's life, Jesus was at the center. And that's the challenge to all of us, is Jesus at the center of our marriage? It's intended, that's it. And the priest should talk about that. It's a beautiful teaching. I have a number of things in the book that if hopefully priests will buy this book and just relate the beautiful stories about marriage.
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's get there. And again, you anticipated my next question, which was going to be on the prevalence of divorce within the broader, Christian family. You see it within, especially Protestantism, but that culture has also infiltrated Catholicism, alas, as well. Why is divorce so prevalent in Christian circles now, even though God expressly says, I hate divorce? It's in Scripture. Again, Book of Malachi, I hate divorce. How is this happening?
So I think largely, if you go back to the Anglican, basically we could call that revolution in 1930, the Lambeth Conference, when basically contraception was allowed. And what happened then is that there was basically a domino effect. You could say, well, it was these Anglicans, but that shouldn't have affected the other Protestant sects. But it really affected all of them. And so what happens, what the church does in response, because remember that was at a time when the overpopulation talk was just, everybody was talking about it. There's too many people, the world's going to tip over, we don't have enough food, whatever that was, right? So the Anglicans sort of added a bit of a theology to it, or in a sense, I should say, took a theology away from it, right? Now, the Catholic Church responds with Casti Condobi and says, wait a minute, they're wrong, here's why. That was awesome. That was the perfect response. But I think in answer to your question, that's what started this. But the problem is that I think that Catholics sort of wanted, many Catholics who, they wanted to use contraception and thought, well, my Protestant friends are doing it, therefore Christianity allows it. And I think, one thing led to the other. And then we fast forward to the encyclical Humanae Vitae. And when that came out, Father Charles Curran, who, and I always say, yes, I am old enough to remember him. Father Curran taught at Catholic University and organized basically a revolt against Humanae Vitae, and came out as a huge fan of contraception and say, well, this is a responsible parenthood. The church doesn't have any authority to be making these comments, and many of the priests followed him. And I think once you give up on that primary purpose, once you give up on that and reject that, that's where divorce comes from. And that's essentially, I think, what started. From there, it's only gotten worse.
So you see divorce as rooted in the contraceptive mentality and the contraceptive culture?
Yes.
What's the connection there?
Well, I think, again, if you are in any sort of human endeavor, if there's a primary purpose of something, so like Aristotle says that an end is the thing sought first in intention and last in realization, whatever it is that we're doing. And the problem is that when an institution loses its primary function, it's lost. You see this even happen with corporations. Like, well, you're going against your founding principles. You said, well, these principles are better. Well, but you were founded in this way, and you're not following it anymore. And I think that's largely it. And because the problem too is this. So, I have a section on living wage. I don't know if this is going to be a popular section in my book, but it's true. The church has taught that families, heads of families, should be paid a living wage.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all over. I mean, that's not just one place either. It's even in the Charter on Human Rights put out by the Vatican in the 80s. They talk about, a right to a wage sufficient to be able to save, to be able to have reasonable recreation, so that only one person in the family has to work. Absolutely.
That's it. And so, but the problem is what you have now is that many Catholics I've spoken with, just on an individual basis, they don't like the living wage doctrine. They think, well, it's impossible to try to define what the living wage would be. Well, it comes under upbringing. Upbringing might be very difficult to define precisely, but the fact of the matter is that we know that's a primary purpose. So, to your point about the connection between divorce and how that sort of plays out, the problem is that if I went into my employer, like I worked on Wall Street for 17 years, so if I went in, and I was self-employed, but had I had a manager or had an employer, I could have walked in and said, you know what, I just had my 9th child, I'm going to need a raise. They would laugh. They'd think it was funny. They would literally laugh. They would think that, like, okay, that's funny, John, go back to work, right? But the thing is that and why would you have that? There was a time that wouldn't have been laughed at, right? I want to have a family, right? We want to be able to have a family. The economy is not structured any longer to support families, and largely that is because we have a divorce culture. You're not supposed to have a big family, right? In the eyes of the world, what do you do? I walk into a place with 9 kids. You get a lot of questions like, are they all yours? Are you like, no, I'm running a camp. You know what I mean? Like
I get that a lot. I'm only 2/3 as irresponsible as you, and I get looks myself. People are like, but how is this possible? It's like, well, I'm married and I'm not a public sinner, so I have these. So this is what happens, Well,
that's it. So really, there has to be an embrace. There has to be an ecclesiastical embrace of the concept of large families. There should be, and in fairness, there are many priests that are doing that. I see that more now than I did, let's say, years ago. But that's the problem. And so the church needs to come out against a divorce culture. But we're probably going to get this in a little bit. But the problem is that on a diocesan level, the church has not only not gone against a divorce culture, but actually embraced it.
Sure. Yeah, and one thing to add there is once you do tinker with the underlying definition of a thing, then it's to say why not tinker again? So once you deny that marriage is ordered towards the begetting of offspring, and that's one of its fundamental components, well, then you can shift it all around. You can say, hey, it's not for life either. And then you can say, hey, it's not between a man and a woman either. So it's funny,
that's right.
Like all these, the WASP Protestants in America who are up in arms that the Supreme Court said, yeah, gay marriage is a thing or whatever. These are the same people who reaped the quote-unquote benefits of that when it came to ushering in Protestant, like, no-fault divorce and kind of rubber stamping that when government, again, changed the definition of marriage. So yeah, absolutely, to your point, once you tinker with the definition of a thing, don't be mad when it gets tinkered with again by somebody who's more extreme even than you are comfortable with. So that said,
right.
let's pivot to the annulment issue in the church. And I've heard this, I used to work for an apostolate that's attached to a canon law apostolate, and I've heard that there's basically a rubber stamp for annulments, and that these things just de facto, as a matter of course, get greenlit. Like you apply for annulment, you got it, bud. It's just Catholic divorce. What is annulment, and why is there a crisis going on in the church with it?
So an annulment, as I think I mentioned earlier, I don't like the word annulment. Nobody should really like it. What it should be is a finding of nullity. So a finding of nullity means that the marriage was never valid. It was never a marriage. So the tribunal should determine, the tribunal's job, ultimately the bishops, to determine whether the marriage was valid. But the problem is that when we go back to the late 1960s, there were no, gosh, it was a pretty tough time because we don't even have time to catalog the problems in the 1960s. But part of the problem with that relates to this is that psychology, or as I could call in the book, psychobabble, was becoming in vogue, right? So what you had is the argument that, well, did they really have the maturity to marry? And this became sort of the psychological grounds of nullity. It was basically the toast of the town. People would say, well, they weren't, there were psychological issues, there was this, there was that. There is in the Canon Law Society of America, I believe it is in their canon law, I forget the name of the book, but it's like the Canon Law Explained or something. They give an example of this. And their example is that, well, if a girl gets married, but her view of marriage was influenced by the play Romeo and Juliet, it might not be valid on that basis. And I think, that's interesting. So in the book, I point out that, okay, what if my view of marriage were somewhat based on the Beach Boys song, Wouldn't It Be Nice? Remember the song? Wouldn't it be nice if we were, right? It's a beautiful song,
Good
right?
Song, yeah,
I think it's a great song. I thought about quoting in my book. I think it's a great song, right? It's actually not bad theology, by the way. In any case, so there was sort of a thing where. So what happened is that annulments turned out to be not a procedure to find evidence to then arrive at a decision. These were decisions in search of evidence.
Right.
Well, what could it be? And so there was in one of the dioceses, I believe it's in New Jersey, there is a brochure called "Selecting the Grounds." Meaning that, okay, well, could you, if you're looking for an annulment, could you have grounds? Selecting the grounds, right? As though you're buying coffee, like literally, like selecting the grounds. So they go through all these different things and say, well, do any of these boxes apply to you? And you go through and you're supposed to check them. Well, among those boxes in that brochure are, well, did one of the couple, did he or she have limited dating experience? That could check a box. Were they under duress of some kind? Was something really important going on in their lives? Was there a child on the way? Those sort of questions, right? Well, it doesn't take long to figure out that if you were going to use that list, you have to annul the marriage of Mary and Joseph. Is anybody prepared to do that? And so, I mean, that's how crazy this has become.
Right.
So the problem is that everything sort of all marriages start to look like, oh, these are potentially annullable. And in fact, I quote Cardinal Burke, the former head of the Apostolic Signatura. So he had been in a unique position to know how this was all playing out. He was sort of wondering, well, can anybody be sure they're married? And that's the problem I want to talk about a little bit, because some people listening to this will say, well, I mean, like in my particular case, me, John Clark, I have a storybook marriage, okay? I've been married 31 years. I've had a crush on my wife since the day I met her, okay? That's my life, okay? So this isn't, the annulment question doesn't pertain to me immediately, but here's how it does pertain to me and every other marriage. Is that if dioceses start looking at marriages as potentially just things to find null, what makes my marriage so unique? The fact that we get along? I mean, I was only 21 when we got married. I would have, frankly, I always say, I would have married Lisa when I was 18. I knew I was in love with her. I would have gotten married. I wanted to go to college. I would like to getting a job. But seriously, if we're sort of looking at all marriages as suspect, that is not a good thing to do.
It's almost like it seems like the subtle change to the standard is that you have to have perfect knowledge of the sacrament going in and absolutely perfect freedom going in, as opposed to substantial knowledge and substantial freedom to embrace this sacrament. And of course, you know, this side of the eschaton, you don't get that. And what you said earlier rings true also. I come from a legal background. I was a judicial law clerk. I've read cases for a court and had to read the pro side and the con side, the motion and the response to motion. And it's not like one side makes an argument and the other one's like, oh, okay, you're right, it's good. You can always make a legal argument. And in every legal case that exists, there is a good argument and a bad argument. Like a right argument that you're going to side with, and a wrong argument that you are going to say, no, this is not going to carry the day. And it seems like now, based on what you're saying, the standard has become, well, if you can articulate an argument for why this marriage is null, it was void ab initio, then you're good. Then you can go and get an annulment. And that seems like, am I wrong? Is that the wrong impression?
No, that's pretty much it. And in fact, you mentioned earlier, there are some dioceses in America that approve 100% of applications for nullity. 100%. Now, you got to remember that there has to be what's called, there was an office called Defender of the Bond, the Defender of the Bond of Marriage. That is to say, it is his or her job to sort of be the advocate, well, not sort of, to be the advocate for marriage. Now, there's a marriage here. But I really wonder how much these people are paid, because if your job is to argue that a marriage is valid, and you never find one, and that it never goes your way, what are you doing? Like, what is your job? And beyond that, I would say this, that it's becoming more well known now. But Father Gerald Murray from E.W. Chen's Papal Posse, he is a degree in canon law, and he worked with tribunals. And he said at the time he was working that the Roman Rota, which is essentially, we can think of it as, let's say, the Supreme Court of the Catholic Church, was overturning over 90% of annulments from America.
Oh my
Which tells me that we have a rogue court. These marriage tribunals are going rogue.
So they went to like the canon law equivalent of like Thomas Cooley's School of Law, right? Just the absolute. If you're getting, overturned that much, if you're saying it's 100%, and by the way, name names. If people are saying 100% rubber stamp, there's an annulment here, you have grounds for an annulment, that's horrible. That's a travesty against justice, and ultimately that's a sacrilege against, a sacrament of the church, matrimony. Do you know the dioceses that are batting 1,000 for annulling marriages?
Right. So if you go to Bay McFarland runs a group called Mary's Advocate, and she has some links on there that you could find these out. I don't have a list in front of me, but they're on there. So this is it, and it's a fairly well-known thing that, well, if you get approved, and part of it is that, and I want to sort of bring together like how the divorce culture meets what I call an annulment culture. So right now in America, every diocese requires a civil divorce prior to having a hearing at a marriage tribunal. Now, keeping in mind that in America, there was a unilateral no-fault divorce. Okay, this is the way it is. This isn't like my crazy idea. We have a unilateral no-fault divorce, which says what? Why would you have that? Why would you wait for the state to say anything to adjudicate a sacrament? Makes no sense. But from there, it's even stranger when you look at the reasons why, at least the reasons I've been given. The first reason is that the dioceses are worried that they will be an alienation of affection. Now, the term alienation of affection, which I'm sure you well know as an attorney, it's left over from common law. And right now, alienation of affection laws still exist in only 6 states. So basically, this is the idea. So if you are in Florida, I live in Florida. So if there's a diocese in Florida that says, no, we can't risk a lawsuit because if a wife divorces her husband, we're leaving ourselves open to an alienation of affection lawsuit with him. Only they leave out one little part of that. There is no alienation of affection on the books in Florida at all. And in fact, as I say, in 44 states, it's not on the books. So you're really worried about something that doesn't exist. It's not real. And by the way, of the 6 remaining states, it's never prosecuted. Corporations like churches are never prosecuted. It's typically something prosecuted against an adulterer. So again, the logic for it is, it's awful. And so
Well, you wouldn't have to be so worried about money also if you weren't having to pay lawsuits to people that were molested by homosexual priests that you let sneak into the diocese. But that's a whole other thing. I won't go down that road too far.
Right. The other idea is that, well, this is another argument they make, which is even more bizarre in some ways. People say, well, the diocese will say, well, the fact that they're presenting us with divorce paperwork shows us that really they can't be reconciled. Is that what it shows? Again, you have a unilateral no-fault divorce. So if you look at the Catechism, what's interesting in the Catechism is when you read the section on divorce, the church. So some people will say, well, the church allows divorce under some circumstances. Yeah, that's true. But the way that the Catechism presents divorce, it's sort of like war. Well, I don't know what you guys are. It'd be like saying, I don't know why you guys don't like all these wars. I mean, the Catechism allows war. Yeah, but under very, extreme circumstances. In the case of this, the church is requiring divorce, the dioceses, I should say, are requiring divorce for every single couple as the opening move before the marriage tribunal can even convene. And this is why I say that unilateral no-fault divorce leads to unilateral no-fault annulment. This is how it plays out. Something like 70% of people in America who are divorced never wanted the divorce. I would assume that's higher for annulments. You see, this is where it sort of plays into. We should be saying, no, this is wrong. We should be hearing sermons about why unilateral no-fault divorce is terrible. It's a terrible thing. And so that's the problem. We're sort of like playing along with it. In fact, people say annulment is not divorce. That's true. But right now in America, the dioceses are insisting on divorce even before annulment. It's pretty bad.
Right, and let's be also clear, those people who are relying on, these tribunals to say that there is a nullity there, if the tribunal is getting it wrong, they're in no way at fault. They're in clear conscience as long as they've represented their case forthrightly to that tribunal. But the fact is, tribunals sure as heck are at fault, and they're, not doing any services towards the sacrament of matrimony, and they're making it just seem like this is the equivalent of Catholic divorce, right? I think that's what a lot of people think. It's a Catholic version of divorce.
Yeah, sure. And I think that realistically, this is addressed. I spent a lot of time in the book going over the talks that Pope St. John Paul II had to the Roman Rota. And he was constantly saying, there are too many annulments going on. The church is, you look back at what the popes have said about annulments. Popes don't like annulments. I mean, the fact, and again, my contention in this book is not, well, there should never be any annulments. There should be no findings of nullity. That's not my contention. Of course there should be findings of nullity. Of course,
sure,
100%. That's true. But the fact of the matter is that when you go from 350 or so to 70,000 in one generation, oh, and by the way, there's another little fact that should go alongside of that, another data point. So in the late 1960s, at that same time, you had the low annulments. You had over 400,000 couples getting married every year in the church. 400,000. 2 generations later, you go to fast forward to 2020, there were fewer than 100,000 weddings in America. Now, some people listening to this will say, yeah, but that was the COVID year. Well, a couple of points on that. One of them is there was 2020 was a year of tragedy for the sacraments in many ways because churches were closed. People weren't allowed to get anointing of the sick. People couldn't go to confession. You couldn't receive the Eucharist. It's pretty bad all around. But the thing about marriages was, or you can't get your baby baptized either. I had a couple that I'm friends with a couple who waited, I believe, nearly a year to get their baby baptized because COVID. And so in 2020, you'd say, well, the number of marriages is probably down because, after all, the number of everything was down. Except for the fact that 100,000 number follows the well-worn trajectory. So we would have probably been about that number either way. It might have been a little bit higher. But you're talking about annulments going from 350 to 70,000 and weddings going from 400,000 to 100,000.
Yikes.
You know what's really strange about this? I don't know why this isn't the talk in the Catholic Church right now? Why isn't this the theme? What's more important than marriage? I mean, I always say if we lose marriage, we lose. End of sentence in a paragraph.
Of course.
So
it's the training grounds for future generation is the family. So what happens to the family, so goes the nation, and so goes the whole world. That's John Paul II.
Sure.
Boy, if only Henry VIII could have just come to America and gone through a tribunal here, his marriage would have been annulled just like that, and we could have avoided that whole schism thing with the Anglicans. Yeah, too bad. If only he had a time machine and reliable transportation over the sea. But that's another thing. What can we do now about the problem with annulments? And real fast, because I want to get to, some other topics.
Okay, so I think that ecclesiastically, what needs to be done is that the civil divorce mandate needs to be halted right away. I think that's absolutely key to this entire thing. The civil divorce mandate in America, which allows unilateral no fault, that has to stop right away. As individual couples, I think this is a key part of the book, too, I wanted to spend a lot of time on. And by the way, I hope the book comes across as very hopeful, because the last few certainly chapter 10, this is sort of like my homage to matrimony, and in large measure, the book is a love letter to the Eucharist, as Catherine Godfrey Howell pointed out, and I think that's a great way to look at this. But so Catholic couples have to take it upon ourselves to save our marriages. Now, what does that mean? I can't keep finger pointing as opposed to doing something to help my own marriage. So what does that mean? Live a sacramental life. My wife and I try to go to a daily mass whenever we can. That makes our marriage stronger. When I go to confession, it makes my marriage stronger. When I say the rosary with my family, it makes my marriage stronger. There are things we can do. I hope that the church, the dioceses, adopt many of the things I've outlined in here on an ecclesiastical level. But assuming that none of that happens, we simply have to do what we can to nourish our marriages. And that there's a section on this about how to do that too. So that is what we can do. Live good lives, live virtuous lives, live holy lives. Support people who are in trouble. Like I wrote this book to help my friend. I'm happy I did it. And I think that we need to stand by and help people. There are people who are standing for their marriage. We refer to them as standers. People who are there, who have been abandoned. These people are living heroic lives, and we need to support people who are standing for marriage. That's so important, also.
Just permit me one other thing on this, and then I promise we'll pivot. Why the heck aren't the bishops getting involved? Those in these dioceses that do have the rubber stamp for the tribunals that are just granting annulments, passing them out like they're candy, why don't the bishops crack down on that? And that's where, if we could know those dioceses, then we could, get some people to maybe flood those chanceries with some angry letters and lobby for some action.
I wish I had a good answer for you. I think that in some cases, maybe they haven't really thought about this much. I guess I'm trying to put the best possible spin on it, right? And I don't even know what that is. I don't know how, again, I'm at a loss. Like, I don't know. It's exasperating because you think your job, I don't know. I'm sorry. I know that's a really bad answer. I don't know. But I think that is the answer. I don't know. What is going on? It's what we should all be asking. Let's start with that question. What's going on?
Sure. It's a sacrament of life. And I don't want to hear any more complaints about the crisis of men in the priesthood, the lack of vocations, because by killing the family, by killing marriage, the natural, this natural begetting of life that comes through marriage, of course, leads to supernatural life in the sacrament of orders. These are the two sacraments of life, but the sacrament of orders is predicated upon the sacrament of marriage, which furnishes generous children that parents can be happy to see go into religious life in the priesthood. And so, I don't want to hear it anymore. Oh, our diocese is starved for people to come into the priesthood. It's like, well, you sowed your own poison. But let's pivot.
Okay.
Let's talk about feminism. You write about feminism as an attack on marriage and the family. That's a topic that's very close to my own heart. How is it? I mean, there's going to be some skeptical person out there that's like, well, I thought it was about women having equal rights and all that stuff. Let's disabuse the skeptics in the audience that there's anything good that comes out of feminism.
Well, to this point in particular, we could look at it this way. So if you look at Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, and I go through this in detail, the rise of feminism. Feminism is incredibly anti-marriage. And by the way, and again, the problem with feminism is that it's such a term of ambiguity. It means different things to different people, right? I'm talking about the sort of American feminism that looks at Betty Friedan as, no, she really got it. She understands marriage. I mean, she really does. And I think that it's anti. I mean, the best thing it is, like, it's anti-marriage. And what I wanted to do in the book was, I mean, when I sat down to write the section in this book about feminism, I thought it'd be bad. I kind of thought, in other words, I thought that the comments that the leaders of feminism had made would be pretty bad. It was much worse than I thought. They are so blatantly anti-marriage. In fact, Betty Friedan, I believe, referred to the family and marriage as a concentration camp.
Yeah, the domestic life is a comfortable concentration camp. Yeah,
right. So
feminine mystique.
That's incredibly offensive to everyone. And yet, that's what people were reading, and I think that's what they're reading now. And so, she has this sort of her view of marriage is so bad that when it got to the rest of the world, they sort of believe, well, she must know what she's talking about. My question in the book is, why would she know what she was talking about? But again, it's one of those things. It's sort of, and look, the reality is that the devil, we talked about the fact that God loves marriage. The devil hates marriage. So, we see that there's a demonic influence with a lot of these people. I think that's fairly clear. And so, feminism took a terrible toll in America. It's still there. It's still there.
Well, absolutely. And this is one critique I would actually have about that particular chapter is you seem to single out second wave feminists for getting, for being pointed at and being scolded. But really, this was true of first wave feminists every bit as much, if not more so. They loathed marriage. The bitter old shrews like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they hated marriage, and they could only tolerate it insofar as they could redefine it to make it completely egalitarian against the Bible. And this is why Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote an entire women's Bible commentary that erased supposed sexist language from Holy Writ. So it's always been something that's deeply embedded in feminism, not just the second wave, but the first wave too. And these people that we're told should be treated almost like American heroines, they're actually, wicked hags. They did so much to destroy the family. Is that something you looked into in your research? Or I know that Friedan and de Beauvoir, they're people that, Simone de Beauvoir wanted to make it essentially illegal for women to be housewives. She wanted government to come in and take them away. And, very much in the vein of Marxism, where they wanted to break the patriarchy by removing women from the household. So obviously they also were great. They had great errors against marriage. But did you look into the first waivers?
So largely what I was looking at was sort of a time and place to go back and say, okay, so what was going on? So I'm looking basically at, I wanted to do a snapshot basically of the 60s, because again, all of my research kind of has that same sort of data point, like that chronologically. It was to say that, okay, what happened? So 1968, you have a boom in annulments. You've got a boom in feminism. You've got, pornography. You've got all these different things. And so there seemed to be a convergence of all of these things. So really, not to discount the points you just made, but I think it was largely pointing out that, okay, what was going on then? It was sort of like, okay, if you could pick up a newspaper in the late 1960s, what would the stories be? But your point is well taken insofar as, Betty Friedan's nonsense didn't come from nowhere. So, I mean, these things tend to have precursors. So, but I was simply looking at a particular time and place.
Oh, absolutely. No, that's fair enough. I want to point out, this is a Susan B. Anthony quote. I do not consider divorce an evil by any means. She says, I would not object to marriage if it were not that women throw away every plan and purpose of their own life to conform to the plans and purposes of man's life. These were not pro-marriage people. And yet, I think as you pointed out, the second waiver's built upon this, and they say that they built upon this. How can we undo feminism? Because it's been pointed out by many feminist scholars that it's just in the air and water now. People take for granted things that would have been considered revolutionary thoughts about the relationships between the sexes only 30 years ago. They just take it for granted. Of course I'm going to have a career when I'm married and I have children. Of course I'm going to have a job outside the home. You were talking about the church's doctrine on a living wage. People would look at you cockeyed about that. Well, why do you have to pay a living wage to the head of a household? Don't both people work? Doesn't the church think that's good? How do we undo this? It's in the air and water. It's completely saturated the culture.
Well, I think that's 100% true. And I think that it's not just true for that. It's true for many things. And so, to be honest with you, the answer for my family has been homeschooling in large measure. The fact of the matter is that society is pretty lost right now. We're unhappy. The royal we are unhappy. We are atheistic.
Right.
This is that idea that the sort of like the devil sort of the devil is keeps making the same temptations to people. It's what's changed from the garden now? Not much. But the idea is that, well, if you just are in it for yourself, you'll be happier. Well, we're as atheistic in America as we've ever been, correct? Like, I think the stats would support that statement. Are we happier for it? So I think largely speaking that, look, we have to educate our families. Moms and dads have to teach their children the truth, the beautiful truth. And they're going to find out that everybody's happier in the process for it, too. But to your point, that's true. Look, I have 5 daughters. And so who are my daughters' heroes? Mary, Joan of Arc, Saint Bernadette. And I think that, I met with Cardinal Gagnon years ago, the head of the Pontifical Council for the Family. It was in, I think it was the late 80s, I want to say. And so there was a dinner. He was out in Virginia. There was a dinner. And someone asked him, I think the question was something like, kind of the question you just asked, what do we do now? We're lost. What do we do? And I'll always remember his answer. He said, read the lives of the saints. And that was a great answer. I've always remembered that. And I think that if we're going to try to figure out what we should be doing, right? What is virtue? What is the good life? What are we called to be? What are we called to do? We need to look back. We need to read the classic works. We need to look at the saints of old and how they function. I think that the lives of the saints, I think for parents listening, give your children the lives of the saints. Read the lives of the saints. When I was growing up, my mom, when we said our prayers before our homeschooling day, I'm Mary Kay Clark. Some of your listeners probably know who that is. So when we had our homeschool day, it would start off with a litany of the saints. We heard about the saints all the time. We have a reading of the saint that day. We litany of the saints. But I think to your point, it's a great one. We need to learn. We need to teach our daughters what is a hero. Who are the heroes? Betty Friedan is not a hero in our house, right? So we parents can decide in large measure who are presenting to be heroes for our children. We're going to start doing that.
Right. Right, you have to present them with good role models, and now it's like, well, here's this WNBA player, like lesbian, that you're supposed to take after, or this powerful corporate woman that goes home to her cold, childless home full of cats, and this is what you're aspiring to be. It's like, yeah, no thanks. Why won't priests talk about this, though? When's the last time you heard a good old barn burner about how feminism's disordered and evil and is trying to dethrone patriarchy, which is willed by God, which is ironic that they have a blind spot there because, the church is patriarchal. It's like priests would be like, well, we're very egalitarian in the family, except for that whole, only men can rule the church type thing.
Yeah.
I mean, why won't they say it from the pulpit? We need to hear that. People need to hear that. Let's hear from the Catechism of Trent that a woman should only go out with her husband's permission and when she's required by necessity to do so. That would seem to prohibit having the needless glamour careers.
So I would look at it this way. I mean, we can, by the way, there's a really, well, I guess I should look at it this way. So, our Lord gave us teachings about marriage. We should follow them, right? And if the primary purpose of marriage is what the church says it is, and we believe that it is, this is infallible teaching, we all need to follow that. Husbands need to follow that. Wives need to follow that. And we that is not to say that all families need to be doing the same things. We all have the same doctrine that we're taught, right? This is how we have to look at it. And I think that we need to look even more fundamentally. We need to look at what is virtue. We don't really seem to want to have that conversation. We need to get back to the basics of what it is, of what is marriage. Why are we here? We don't seem to want to have that. But I think to your point about the sermons, frankly, many sermons seem as though they polled the audience prior to the sermon, right?
Yeah.
What should I talk about? Now, I can tell you this. I've always thought that the sermon that I least wanted to hear, me, John Clark, was the one I needed to, there were some things I need to hear, right? So, if there's a sermon against feminism, to me, that's not really an issue for me, right?
Right.
But there are some things that are, and so I need to hear those. But realistically, priests do no favors to their parishioners by not telling them the truth, speaking to them about what virtue is.
Right. And it's all there in black law, the black letter law. You can see this all. Again, it's people are afraid and embarrassed of the church's doctrines because you can go read Rerum Novarum. A woman is suited for homework. You can go read Quadragesimo Anno. You can go read all of these documents, the Catechism of Trent, that teach the things, but it's not getting down to the people. So that said, we are out of time for today, but I want to give you a chance to say kind of last-minute exhortation to the audience. What would you want people to take away about the sacrament of matrimony, about how it's under attack, about how they can proceed forward in a culture that is against them? That almost is rooting for marriages to fail, that undercuts it at every opportunity it can. What do you say to our audience and to all people of goodwill out there?
Well, I think the thing is we always have to have hope. There are times that have looked bad. Do things look great in the church right now? Not really, okay? But we have to have hope because we know this, because we know that Mary loves marriage. We know that God loves marriage. And I think really more than any time in the past, and this has always been true, we have to, especially men, we live in a pornographic culture that, by the way, we talked about, you were just mentioning rejecting motherhood and rejecting femininity. Well, they're also rejecting fatherhood. If the idea is, again, we were looking at it thinking that God ordained it to be the normative way for children to have a mom and dad. When's the last time anybody championed fatherhood? In other words, we're rejecting. It started off with, well, father is not very important to a family. After all, a mom could do it. Now we're having that conversation about mothers. We don't need mothers either, so they can be raised by the state. And so we have to just sort of break free of the nonsense that the culture is telling us. Okay, so we have to go back to, and then, as I say, live sacramental lives. So important. Draw closer to Jesus. Do the basic things that we should be doing. Husbands, love your wives. If your marriage is having difficulty, love them more. Pray for your spouse. Draw closer. Marriage is not simply about a husband and wife. It's about a husband, wife, and God, and children. And so we have to, look at the things that are basic, because we're not hearing them now, and we're just lost. So get back, do those things, read Casti Connubii. right? Go back and read the classic documents, you know? That's what I would suggest.
Absolutely. No, great advice, because it's the theme of the show. It's all out there in the black letter law. Casti Connubii, Arcanum, these things speak to what marriage is. And we reject certain false notions. And the popes have been very clear, Pius XI, and Leo XIII, talking about these things. Marriage was fixed in the will of God. It is not changeable for modern society. These things were given to us by God himself, and that stuff needs to get down, needs to matriculate downward to the people in the pews. So read the documents, primary sources, you guys. Thank you so much for being on with us. John, we appreciate you. Guys, this is another episode of Mic'd Up. Thanks for tuning in. Please do support us with your eyes, and if you have the means, with your wallets. It takes a lot to do what we do here, to do the preparation and put in the man hours to make this show. Please do kindly keep us, as Mother Angelica would say, in between your gas and electric bills here at Church Militant. We will see you next week. God bless you.